Dean Martin truly hated Jerry Lewis. Now we know the reason why. To understand why the hatred eventually burned so hot, you have to understand just how bright the fire was when it first started. Go back to 1946 in Atlantic City. The world was just waking up from the nightmare of World War II, and people were desperate to feel something good again. But Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis weren't saving the world. They were barely saving themselves. Dean was a struggling crooner with a velvet voice but zero direction, bouncing between hotels and gambling debts, a man who looked like a movie star but lived like a drifter. Jerry was a skinny, manic kid, lip-syncing to records, desperate for a laugh, terrified of silence, and practically invisible to the industry. Separately, they were nothing special. They were destined to be footnotes in show business history, two more names on a long list of guys who didn't quite make it. But then, fate stepped in with a heavy hand. They were thrown together on a bill at the 500 Club, a venue that smelled of desperate ambition and stale beer. The owner was ready to fire them both. They had nothing to lose, so they decided to throw out the script. When they stepped on stage together that night, the laws of physics seemed to break. It wasn't rehearsed comedy. It was pure, chaotic jazz. Dean was the king of cool, the unshakable, handsome anchor who stood there with a drink and a cigarette, looking like he owned the universe. Jerry was the kid, the unpredictable storm of energy who would cut ties, smash plates, spill drinks, and literally climb the curtains. It was a collision of order and chaos that nobody had ever seen before. The dynamic worked because it tapped into something primal in the American psyche. Dean represented the man every guy wanted to be, smooth, unflappable, and in control. Jerry represented the Ed, the inner child, the one who did everything you weren't allowed to do in polite society. Audiences didn't just like them, they were obsessed. Women wanted to save Jerry and date Dean. Men wanted to hang out with Dean and protect Jerry. It was a perfect psychological lock and key. The laughter they generated wasn't polite, it was hysterical, gut-busting relief. They were doing something that shouldn't have worked, mixing high-class singing with lowbrow slapstick, and somehow it became magic. The rise that followed was terrifyingly fast. Within months, they went from making $350 a week to earning millions. They couldn't walk down the street without causing riots. They were the rock stars of the 1950s before rock and roll even existed, dominating nightclubs, radio, television, and eventually Hollywood. They controlled the industry with a snap of their fingers. They were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences, sharing the same hotel suites, and creating a bond that seemed impenetrable. To the outside world, they were a two-headed monster of success that could never be slain. But beneath the deafening laughter and the sold-out shows, a dangerous seed was being planted. The press, the critics, and the studios began to construct a narrative that would slowly poison the well. They started calling Jerry the genius. They labeled him the comedic mastermind, the heir to Charlie Chaplin, the one with the vision. And Dean? They dismissed him. They called him just the singer. They called him a straight man, a prop, a handsome piece of furniture there to hold Jerry up. For a man as proud and talented as Dean Martin, that wasn't just an annoying critique. It was a slow-acting poison that began to eat away at the foundation of the greatest act in history. By 1954, the brotherhood that had conquered the world was beginning to rot from the inside out. The dynamic that had made them rich was now making them miserable, transforming their partnership into a toxic cage. Jerry Lewis, fueled by the relentless praise of critics who hailed him as an auteur and a genius, began to evolve into something Dean could no longer recognize. Jerry wasn't content with just being the comic half of the team anymore. He wanted to control the entire universe they inhabited. He wanted to write the scripts, direct the scenes, edit the footage, and manage the production. The manic energy that was so charming on stage had curdled into a suffocating need for control behind the scenes, leaving no room for anyone else to breathe. Dean, on the other hand, was wired completely differently. He didn't care about artistic legacies or being called a genius. He cared about living his life. He wanted to do the show, sing his songs, be funny, and then go play a round of golf before going home to his family. He despised the pretension of Hollywood, the method acting, and the endless, agonizing discussions about the craft that Jerry loved so much. To Dean, it was a job, a great job, but just a job. But Jerry's intensity was becoming impossible to ignore. He began to treat Dean less like a partner and an equal, and more like a recalcitrant employee who needed to be managed, directed, and corrected. The breaking point didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, painful death by 1,000 cuts. Scripts started arriving at Dean's door with pages missing or scenes rewritten, his lines trimmed down to almost nothing, while Jerry's monologues grew longer. Movie posters began to feature Jerry's face looming larger than Dean's, a visual confirmation of what the industry was already whispering. Then came the public humiliations, the moments that stung the pride of a man who was already feeling marginalized. The most infamous was a Look magazine article titled, "Jerry Lewis is no stooge." In the accompanying photo, Dean had been literally cropped out of the picture, leaving only his hand visible on Jerry's shoulder. It was a brutal message. Dean was becoming a ghost in his own act. Rumors suggest that the final explosion happened backstage during the filming of one of their last movies, You're Never Too Young. The air on set was already freezing. The crew walked on eggshells, terrified of triggering a meltdown. Dean, fed up with being bossed around, talked down to, and treated like a prop, finally reached the limit of his legendary patience. He didn't scream, and he didn't throw a punch. Dean Martin never had to yell to be terrifying. He simply went cold, his eyes losing all their warmth, and looked Jerry dead in the face with an expression of absolute detachment. In a voice barely above a whisper, Dean delivered the line that would haunt Jerry Lewis for the rest of his life. He reportedly said, "You know what you are to me? You're nothing but a dollar sign." It was a devastating thing to say to a man who had looked up to him like a big brother, a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in their connection. Jerry was crushed, later admitting he went to his trailer and wept like a child. In that moment, the love was gone. The trust was broken. The act was technically still alive, but the brothers were dead. They were just two strangers waiting for the contracts to run out. When they finally walked off that stage at the Copacabana on July 25, 1956, the silence began immediately. It wasn't a casual drift apart. It was a sudden, violent severance. They finished the show, the applause still ringing in their ears, and then simply turned their backs on one another. There were no goodbyes, no handshakes, and no closure. It was a disciplined, iron-willed silence that would harden like concrete over the next 20 years. The two men who had once shared a heartbeat now refused to share the same air. The partnership that had defined a decade was over, replaced by a bitterness so deep it felt like a physical weight on the entire entertainment industry. Hollywood, for all its glamour, is a remarkably small town, and the split turned the social scene into a minefield. They ran in the exact same circles, ate at the same Italian restaurants, and had the same best friends, like Frank Sinatra. But they became experts at the art of avoidance, operating like rival spies in a Cold War. There are stories from this era that sound almost absurd in their pettiness. If Dean was dining at a popular spot like Chasen's or Morton's, the maitre d' knew, under penalty of death, not to seat Jerry. If they were invited to the same party, they stayed on opposite sides of the room. with mutual friends forced to act as buffers, nervously navigating the demilitarized zone between them. Sinatra, to his credit, managed to stay friends with both, but even the chairman of the board couldn't bridge the gap. The public perception during these early years shifted wildly, and the betting money was almost entirely against Dean. The narrative was set. Jerry was the genius, the creative engine, the star. Dean was just the handsome guy who stood next to him. Everyone thought Dean would fade into obscurity, ending up as a lounge singer in second-rate clubs. But Dean Martin shocked the world. He didn't just survive, he thrived. He reinvented himself with a vengeance, stripping away the straight man persona to reveal a brilliant, understated actor. He starred in serious, critically acclaimed films like The Young Lions and Rio Bravo, holding his own against giants like Marlon Brando and John Wayne. Then he launched The Dean Martin Show, which became one of the biggest hits on television. He proved that he wasn't just a prop. He was a star who could command a room without screaming for attention. Jerry, meanwhile, had his own massive success, but it came with a heavier price tag. He dove headfirst into his obsession with control, writing, directing, and starring in comedy masterpieces like The Nutty Professor. He became the auteur the critics always said he was, signing the most lucrative contract in Hollywood history. But personally, reports and biographies suggest he was suffering. He had an intense, bottomless need for validation that Dean never had. Fast forward to Labor Day weekend, September 1976. The scene was the annual Muscular Dystrophy Telethon, a broadcast marathon that had become an American institution. Jerry Lewis was hosting, just as he did every year, but he was no longer the fresh-faced kid who climbed curtains. He was older now, his face lined with exhaustion, sweating profusely under the unforgiving studio lights as he pleaded for donations. The feud with Dean Martin had been raging for 20 years by this point. It was the elephant in the room of pop culture, a silence so loud that it echoed through every interview Jerry gave. The entire world knew they hated each other. The entire world accepted that the book was closed and that these two legends would likely die without ever speaking again. But Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, had decided that 20 years of silence was enough. Sinatra was perhaps the only man on earth with the power and the audacity to intervene in a war of this magnitude. He didn't ask for permission, and he certainly didn't warn Jerry. Working in total secrecy with the telethon's producers, Sinatra orchestrated a live television ambush that would go down as one of the most shocking moments in broadcast history. He knew that if he tried to get them in a room privately, one of them would back out. So he trapped them in front of 40 million witnesses, creating a situation where there was literally nowhere to hide. On air, Sinatra began to tease the moment, telling a confused and weary Jerry, "I have a friend who loves what you do, and he'd love to come out and say hello." You can see the genuine confusion on Jerry's face in the footage. He's expecting a donor, or perhaps a minor celebrity. But then, from behind the curtain, out walked Dean Martin. The reaction from the audience wasn't just applause. It was a seismic roar, a guttural explosion of shock and joy that nearly blew the audio equipment. It was the sound of millions of people realizing that the impossible was happening right in front of their eyes. Jerry looked like he had seen a ghost. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock, and he actually backed away, as if the sight of his old partner was too bright to look at directly. Dean, true to form, was the calm in the center of the storm. He strolled out with a cigarette in one hand, smiling that famous lazy half smile, looking as if he had just stepped out for a smoke break 20 years ago and decided to wander back in. He walked right up to a trembling Jerry, and they embraced. It wasn't a polished Hollywood hug. It was awkward, clumsy, and deeply real. For a moment, the mask slipped. They weren't superstars. They were just two old friends trying to bridge a canyon of regret. Jerry, fighting back tears and trying to break the suffocating tension with comedy, looked at Dean and delivered the perfect line. "So you working?" The studio erupted in laughter, and for a few glorious minutes the world felt right again. The brothers were back. But here is the heartbreaking truth that the cameras didn't show, the part of the story that makes this reunion so tragic. Everyone watching at home thought the war was over. They thought this was the happy ending where the credits roll and the friendship is restored. It wasn't. After the segment ended and the red lights on the cameras turned off, the wall went right back up. Reports say they shared a brief, polite drink backstage, exchanged pleasantries, and then nothing. They went right back to their separate lives. The hug had been real, but the damage was too deep to be fixed in 5 minutes. The silence returned, perhaps even heavier than before, because now they both knew what they were missing. It was a moment of false hope, a cruel reminder that some things are broken beyond repair. The silence that had persisted for decades was finally broken, not by a television producer or a mutual friend, but by a tragedy so profound it shattered the world of the King of Cool. In March 1987, Dean Martin's beloved son, Dean Paul Martin, a golden boy, a captain in the Air National Guard and an athlete, disappeared during a training mission. For days, Dean waited by the phone, praying for a miracle. But the miracle never came. His son's F-4 Phantom jet had crashed into the side of San Gorgonio Mountain in a blinding snowstorm, killing him instantly. It was the kind of loss that doesn't just hurt a man, it hollows him out completely. Dean Martin, the man who had always been untouchable, the man who laughed at everything, died inside that day. The aftermath was heartbreaking to witness. Dean, who had spent his life playing the character of the carefree drunk who didn't give a damn, suddenly couldn't keep the mask on anymore. He quit the highly anticipated Rat Pack reunion tour, leaving Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. bewildered. He retreated into a deep, dark solitude, spending his nights in restaurants alone, staring at a plate of food he wouldn't eat, looking at a wall with eyes that had lost their light. The spark was gone. The man who had charmed the world was now just a ghost, haunting his own life, waiting for the end. He had always kept the world at a distance, but now he built a fortress around his grief that no one could penetrate. When the news of the crash broke, Jerry Lewis didn't hesitate for a second. He didn't call a publicist to draft a statement. He didn't worry about the awkwardness of the past or the 20 years of cold shoulders. He simply acted. He picked up the phone and did the hardest thing a friend can do. He attended the funeral, slipping into the back of the church, not as a celebrity, but as a grieving uncle. He didn't make a scene, he just showed up. For the first time in decades, the ego was gone. The genius and the star vanished, replaced by a man whose heart was breaking for the only person he had ever truly considered an equal. Reports from those close to them say that this was the moment the ice finally melted, not under the hot lights of a television studio, but in the cold darkness of shared grief. They didn't become best friends again in the way they were in 1946. Too much time had passed, and Dean was fading fast, his health declining and his spirit broken. But the wall was down. They began to speak. Late-night phone calls replaced the silence. They acknowledged the bond that had survived the fame, the fights, and the years of separation. It wasn't a loud, public reconciliation. It was quiet, private, and deeply necessary. Jerry later admitted that during these final years, he realized something profound about their relationship, a truth that had eluded him during the height of their fame. He realized that the hate was never really hate at all. It was love that had nowhere to go. It was the frustration of knowing that the one person who completed you was the one person you couldn't live with. The anger that had fueled the feud was just the exhaust pipe for a deep, brotherly passion that had been corked up for too long. In the shadow of death, Jerry finally understood that Dean hadn't been his enemy. He had been his other half, and they were running out of time to say it. So after all the years of silence, the public feuds, and the private tears, we are left with the one question that started it all. Did Dean Martin truly hate Jerry Lewis? The answer, like the men themselves, is complicated. He didn't hate the man. He hated the noise. He hated the suffocating control, the unchecked ego, and the chaotic storm that Jerry brought into his peaceful life. But he never hated the soul of the person who had once split a pastrami sandwich with him when they didn't have a dime to their names. The tragedy wasn't that they were enemies. It was that they were two brothers who forgot how to speak the same language, letting their differences curdle into a silence that lasted a lifetime. Their story serves as more than just a piece of Hollywood history. It is a profound warning to anyone watching. It stands as a stark reminder that pride is the heaviest shield you will ever carry. It protects you from getting hurt, and it protects you from having to say you were wrong. But it also prevents you from being held. For 20 years, two men who loved each other more than they loved their own wives punished themselves with isolation because neither was willing to be the first to blink. They let a business dispute metastasize into a personal war, wasting decades of potential memories because the words "I miss you" were too heavy to lift. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis achieved a level of immortality that few human beings ever touch. They made the entire world laugh during one of its darkest eras. They built an empire, changed the face of comedy, and defined an entire generation of entertainment. But the price of that laughter was their brotherhood. In the end, they found their way back to each other, but only after life had taken almost everything else away. They learned the hardest lesson of all, that you can have all the applause in the world. You can have the money, the fame, and the legacy. But it doesn't mean a thing if you look to your side and there's no one there to share the encore with. We often think we have time. We think we can hold grudges forever, that we can freeze people out to teach them a lesson, assuming that one day, when we're ready, they will still be there. Dean and Jerry proved that time is the one thing you can't negotiate with. They lost the prime of their lives to a stubborn standoff, and by the time the wall came down, the sun was already setting. They reclaimed their friendship in the twilight, but they could never get back the high noon they wasted on anger. Thanks for watching.